Switzerland is a place where they don't like to fight, so they get people to do their fighting for them while they ski and eat chocolate. Larry David. Sandwiched between various, far more powerful countries than themselves, the Swiss have guarded their alpine homeland in the face of countless existential threats, oftentimes shielded from the mayhem and bloodshed around them by their mighty mountain peaks, along with their resilience. Many wonder why the nation even exists, a neutral country that is part German, part French, part Italian, and even some other language called Romash or Romish that barely anyone thinks about outside of Switzerland, and I'm probably mispronouncing anyway. It has a diverse religious background, Catholics and Protestants and irreligious people, along with a growing Muslim population, yet it's still cohesive. What is the glue that holds this country together, and has held this country together over centuries in the face of empires, world wars, fascism, and communism? It wasn't language or ethnicity or religion. The country is way too diverse in all of those categories. Perhaps the glue that held them together was necessity. The rugged mountains of the Alps and the foothills below them spurred this necessity. Switzerland is a landlocked nation, located at the crossroads of Western and Central Europe. This lack of sea routes is probably the main reason why the nation is one of the few in Western Europe that never created its own empire. It also has a temperate climate, made cooler by its high elevation. The Alps are the most well-known feature of the country, stretching across the southern portion of the nation. However, the snow-capped peaks, while great for defensive measures, skiing, and postcards, suck for human habitation. They're too cold, the air is too thin, and you can't grow crops. For this reason, nearly everyone lives along the foothills of the northern half, a region still high enough in elevation to provide protection while giving them access to flat enough land to settle upon, farm, raise livestock, and collect running water from the glaciers above. The northern third of the country is situated on the Swiss Plateau. A plateau is a fairly flat, highly elevated land, making the region perfect for defending against invaders, which is part of the reason why the nation has been safeguarded against much of Europe's past bloodshed. This area also is one of the most wealthy. There are other settlements to the south where the mountain peaks turn into tall hills and valleys, home to much of the Italian and Romash populations. At the very north of the country lies the Jura Mountains, which aren't really so much mountains but tall hills, far shorter than the Alps, and run along the French border, creating a natural barrier. If you're from the US or Canada, you might be familiar with the Rocky Mountains versus the more meager Appalachian Mountains. Now let's move on from the land to the people. In 1949, a noir film called The Third Man came out, and the main character, Harry Lime, played by Orson Welles, said, quote, "In Italy, for 30 years, you had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed. But they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did they produce? The cuckoo clock." Such words encapsulate a nation of cautiousness, risk aversion, civility, peace, and seclusion all at the same time. So let's look back at this history. Various Celtic peoples lived in the region at the time the Romans arrived. The most famous of these tribes were the Helvetii, who conquered much of this area around what is now known as Switzerland, but they were eventually conquered themselves by Emperor Augustus. Despite the Roman conquest of some of these lands, their legacy still lives on through Helvetica font, even though these Celtic peoples didn't even have an actual writing system before the Romans. While the Celts were fairly easy to subjugate, the same was not true for the incoming Germanic tribes. During this period, the plateau became a sort of frontier between the Romans and various Germanic invaders who would eventually sack Rome and dissolve its Western Empire. One group was a collection of unified Germanic tribes called the Alamanni, which I'm mispronouncing. And another was the Kingdom of Burgundy, which would become the proto-state of later-day France. A current-day province of France, mind you. One Germanic tribe would come out on top, the Franks, under Charlemagne, the most powerful man in Western Europe after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, forming his own empire, the Carolingian Empire. The lands of what are now Switzerland then morphed into the Holy Roman Empire, which Voltaire said was not holy, was not Roman, and was not an empire. The Holy Roman Empire was a weird and extremely complex mix of various city-states, kingdoms, and duchies that were quasi-united. It wasn't until the 13th century that the true origins of the Swiss state emerged, under an alliance called the Old Swiss Confederacy. This was an alliance of member states known as cantons. These formed the foundations of the Swiss state today through diplomacy and war. The Swiss infantry had a reputation for being remarkable on the battlefield, but were eventually defeated by a combination of French and Venetian forces. The Protestant Reformation would come about during the 1500s, having a profound impact on the country, as many were frustrated with the Catholic Church's corruption. One major figure of the Protestant Reformation was John Calvin from Geneva, who had strict puritanical interpretations of Christianity that we still see in this city today. Some of these tales are exaggerated, but there is some element of truth. In the city of Geneva, you can sometimes get in trouble for, say, watering your plants on the balcony at the wrong period of time or flushing your toilet at the wrong period of time. Anyway, on to more important matters than flushing toilets. The bitterness between Catholics and Protestants would erupt into the 30 Years' War, which ended in a treaty called the Peace of Westphalia, which is arguably the most important treaty in the history of international relations, setting up the notion of sovereign borders between states, and it also recognized Swiss independence from the Holy Roman Empire. On top of that, Switzerland became formally neutral, which it still holds to this day. However, peace did not last too long. The French hopped on their revolutionary bandwagon, invaded the Swiss, and did away with their decentralized canton-based government. However, Austrian forces stormed in, and Napoleon had to make amends. The Swiss were granted autonomy again, and administrative changes were made, reinstating the cantons, but this also allowed for a more centralized form of government. When Napoleon was defeated, Swiss neutrality was made permanent. However, Swiss forces were allowed to be hired by other governments as mercenaries or as guards. Today, this has become far more limited, and the most famous long-lasting one that still exists to this day are, of course, the Swiss Guards of Vatican City. Aside from some minor scuffles, the Swiss lived in peace and developed a decentralized democracy of cantons. This decentralization is essential in the eyes of many Swiss, for it allows a united country, but also a country that is very diverse in terms of its religious, linguistic, and ethnic traits. You have ethnic Germans, French, you have Catholics, you have Protestants, all living under one nation. If they can manage their own affairs at the regional level, while at the same time pulling in resources together, just in case of an outside threat, it's a win-win-win situation. While much of Europe was engulfed into the bloodbath of the 20th century, Switzerland was fine. It was not invaded during the First World War, and despite several efforts by Hitler to consider invading Switzerland, he decided not to, making the nation one of the very few in Europe to not spill any serious amount of blood during the bloodiest war in human history. However, the Swiss did offer financial services to the Germans, and this has led to some scrutiny. Despite this, there were some minor instances of allies and Axis powers fighting in Swiss territory, oftentimes due to navigation and logistical mistakes. Jews also sought refuge in Switzerland on the onset of World War II. Switzerland would remain neutral during the Cold War, despite being capitalist and democratic. It would combine a market economy with a high cost of living and a very strong social safety net, along with some pretty tough regulations, in a system now known as social democracy. It did not join the US-backed NATO alliance, nor the Soviet-backed Warsaw Pact. It was even hesitant to cooperate too politically or economically with European affairs, as it was not a member of the European Union and still isn't to this day. It is, however, part of the Schengen Treaty, which allows for borders without any significant international border checks. And now we arrive to the present day. Unlike many European nations, the Swiss does have a federal government rather than a unitary government, meaning they have a constitution broken down by a centralized and regional government, which is great for the cantons, since at the end of the day, they're the ones that really run the country in a decentralized manner. There's also a very strong element of direct democracy, in which people can vote on specific issues rather than their elected representatives. This is why Switzerland doesn't really have an official capital city, at least not in the legal sense. It has an alternative to this, a sort of federal city, which is Bern, which isn't even one of the top 3 largest cities. Bern runs much of the federal administration, but keep in mind that much of the administration runs at the level of the cantons anyway, limiting Bern's power. It really is amazing how this country functions, but also thrives under such a decentralized system. And by thriving, I don't just mean living out decently with any bumps and scratches. It's actually one of the wealthiest populations on the planet, with one of the top 10 GDP per capita in the world, and top 5 when it comes to Human Development Index. Occasionally it even gets the top spot. It's also one of the most democratic. It has tough regulations, but its economy produces a tremendous amount of wealth regardless of this. It punches well above its weight. The most well-known aspect of its economy, aside from chocolate, is its banking sector. The most famous of these banks is Credit Suisse. The Swiss banking sector is a bit of, let's just say, a source of sketchiness, as Switzerland is known for having one of the least corrupt governments while having one of the most corrupt financial sectors. Swiss bank accounts are notorious for their lack of transparency and willingness to hold the cash of various shady characters, from the Nazis to terrorist groups to drug cartels. On a lighter note, the country also has major sectors for tourism, pharmaceuticals, and foodstuffs. Some of the most well-known corporations, like Nestle, come into mind, and is arguably the largest food company in the world. The company also has one of the highest tariffs on foreign goodstuffs, and some of the strongest subsidies for domestically produced food. The country also has fairly low taxes by the standards of Western European nations, which do attract businesses. The nation has also invested a lot into research and development. The world's largest lab and center of particle physics research is the Large Hadron Collider, run by the European Organization for Nuclear Research, right on the Swiss-French border. The country also has been at the cutting edge of green technology and infrastructure with hydroelectric power and high-speed rail. Hydroelectric power is particularly useful given that the country has so many mountains and glaciers. Now let's move on to the military. Now, when most people think of the Swiss military, they probably think of Swiss Army knives, but it turns out that neutral countries do indeed need strong militaries, even if they haven't fought in over 200 years. The Swiss, in fact, have a very capable military. Unlike many countries in Europe, Switzerland has been neutral, and therefore, it can't just free ride off of American security. The Swiss have their own national weapons manufacturing and arms technology, which is essential if you're a neutral country, given that the resources must be pooled within your own borders, especially given the fact that Switzerland is landlocked. All able-bodied men are conscripted and keep their military equipment at home, including their guns. However, unlike the United States, these guns aren't really seen as symbols of personal freedom, but rather symbols of national security, and the weapons are heavily regulated. The reason for this policy is that under the threat of an invasion, every able-bodied Swiss man of reasonable age can grab a gun and, with past training, mobilize under a very short period of time to defend their homeland. This doesn't necessarily need to be in the case of an invasion, but perhaps a potential invasion or heightened security. For example, mobilization took place under the Franco-Russian War, and both world wars, even though the Swiss were not invaded. In all of these cases, a system of alpine fortifications were reinforced. Now, thankfully today, Western Europe is much more peaceful than it used to be, and it's unlikely that another mobilization will happen in the near future. Most Western European countries have buried the hatchet with each other and have embraced economic cooperation, of which the Swiss have partially joined. See, the Swiss are quite fond of some economic cooperation, however, they're quite resistant to political cooperation. The Swiss are the Swiss on their own. Keep in mind that today the only major threat to European security comes from Russia, but given that Switzerland is far away from the Russian border, they aren't exactly trembling at the moment. However, the invasion of Ukraine did lead the Swiss to softening some of their neutrality by placing EU sanctions on Russia. This was pretty groundbreaking, even though they have not sent any military equipment, which is in sharp contrast to nearly every country on the continent. This was especially an issue given the number of Russians using Swiss bank accounts. Will this be the beginning of the end of Swiss neutrality? Well, I highly doubt it. Maybe baby steps, but the Swiss in many ways have been shielded from the horrors of their neighbors through that neutrality. And while it is comforting to think that Western Europe's long-lasting peace will last forever, we really don't know for sure. Switzerland will almost certainly never become a superpower or even a great power given its small size and landlocked location. But kilo for kilo, it ranks as one of the most powerful nations on the planet, probably only rivaled by other tiny nations that pack a punch above their weight like the Vatican City or Singapore. Its neutrality and stability have made it the headquarters of headquarters. The World Trade Organization, various UN branches, the World Health Organization, the International Labor Organization, as well as their own organization, the Red Cross, the oldest humanitarian organization in history, are all based in this country. Yeah, they really like organizations. In many ways, this is a form of power. Even FIFA is headquartered in Switzerland. I told you they have lax policies towards non-governmental corruption, didn't I? The Swiss have not been a great power, and they probably never will be. But the world is better off this way. With Switzerland, the world is provided a negotiating table, a safe, civilized place where even the most bitter of enemies can come to their senses. Thanks for watching.